our today's topic, which we are going to discuss, which we are going to cover, is Leninist regimes, their origins, their essence, well, the definition of Leninism as a specific type of regime. And again, as usual, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me, to stop me, ask questions, ask for more detailed explanations. But let me begin with providing you with a list of scholars, of thinkers, who are important, who are of paramount importance for thinking and understanding Leninism as a phenomenon which goes beyond mere ideology and constitutes a specific, well, to some extent, unique type of a societal, political, and ideological, for that matter, system. In my thinking on Leninism as a specific type of society and specific response to liberal capitalist Western version of modernity, and in my thinking, in my attempt to conceptualize conflicts which are inherent to Leninist systems. So my thinking has been influenced greatly by scholars like American political scientist Ken Javid, whose book I mailed you yesterday. Obviously, the founder of world systems analysis, Emmanuel Wallistein. Of course, Emmanuel Wallistein's faithful disciple, faithful student, Georgii Derluguian. Eric Hobsbawm, British historian, famous, perhaps one of the most famous British, and I don't think it's going to be an exaggeration to say he could be the greatest 20th century historian, Eric Hobsbawm. 20th century in Hobsbawm perception, in Hobsbawm sense, in his scheme of things, in his scheme or explanation of history, begins in 1914 with the beginning of World War I. And it ends, not just the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the end of Soviet type system or state socialist regimes, communist regimes, or as Ken Javid defines them, Leninist regimes. Hobsbawm thought that the fall of Leninism in Eastern Europe also spelled doom for Soviet Union. With the fall of Eastern European regimes, it was almost inevitable for Soviet Union also to collapse. And again, those events in Eastern Europe spelled doom for the whole system, for the whole regime. And therefore, the final chapter of Ken Javid's book, well, the whole book has a subtitle. Sorry, the last chapter. The whole book has a subtitle "New World Disorder," which unfortunately was a very acute and precise forecast. The book came out in early 90s, in 1992 or 1993, and it came out amid very optimistic worldview, epitomized, for example, by Francis Fukuyama's article about the end of history, and then he later penned a book with the same title. Remember Francis Fukuyama and his thesis about end of history? That with the fall of communism, collapse of and extinction. I like that term from biology or paleontology, employed by Ken Javid to describe the events of the fall of communism, fall of Leninism. it was the extinction, disappearance, total disappearance of a certain type of a regime. And it was catastrophic, and it was a huge scale event of mammoth proportion and with massive consequences, hugely consequential for global effects. So let me repeat. The key thinkers for understanding Leninist regimes, and then we'll get down to explaining why I agree with Javid in employing the term Leninism instead of state socialism or communist regimes. Socialism and socialism. Socialism is closely connected with social democracy, and social democracy is quite influential ideology and the political force in Western Europe. Recent elections in Germany were won by Social Democratic Party. The previous president of France, of French Republic, was a socialist, member of French Socialist Party. Mitterrand, long-time president of France, had also been a socialist. So I'm of opinion that when we employ the term socialism, then it generates some confusion, like Swedish socialism and Soviet socialism. Entirely different things, like Swedish socialism. Market economy, it's based on market economy. It's got huge corporations, but at the same time, it has a very strong social policy agenda, welfare state. So it's entirely different kind of socialism, although it does have these traits of socialism. Then communism. I'm discontent with the term communism because, according to founders of this ideology, Marx and Engels themselves, communism is a realm of freedom, kind of political freedom, kind of no political domination, incredible economic prosperity, no kind of freedom of so-called freedom of want. And the reality of Soviet communism was entirely different, totally different, right? Kind of, it was very grim, like shortages, purges, repressions on mass scale, unseen scale, perhaps, mass mobilization, brainwashing, and the better description of Soviet communism would be 1984 by George Orwell. I was about to say Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, but Brave New World is more accurate of a description of contemporary world, kind of prosperous Western world, the culture of abundance, but not the Soviet Union, whose modus operandi was the culture and practices of shortages, ideological brainwashing, coercion, but not just coercion, but coercion, repressions were one of the pillars of the regime. So communism, I don't think it's a relevant term. So I was kind of grappling with these issues myself until I came across Ken Javid. First, I had met him in person in early 90s during the summer school in political science in some backwater in Poland, in some forests in Poland. And I had never heard about him before that, prior to that, but I was extremely impressed by his lectures. So I began reading his writings, and I came to conclusion that his writings and his book, Leninist Phenomenon, is encyclopedia of Soviet-type regimes, state socialist regimes, communist regimes, or as Ken Javid, in his own language, defines them, Leninist regimes. So why Leninist regimes? Ken Javid himself comes up with a very interesting and thought-provoking explanation. He says that history, on the most part, has a Protestant nature. What does he mean? We have a general idea of Protestantism as a denomination. So there are lots of different Protestant churches and sects, right? Different movements within this broader movement, right? And they're quite autonomous. So there is a great deal of diversity as far as Protestantism is concerned. So history is very diverse, is very heterogeneous, розмаїтна, багато розмаїття в історії, багато, lots of discrete, separate events, entities, so lots of cultures, lots of political processes, lots of political regimes. It's a little bit of everything. It's incredibly diverse, and more often than not, it's impossible kind of to combine all these disconnected events under the rubric of something uniting, under the rubric of some general notion, one fits it all, as they say. But sometimes history can be Catholic. And again, if you use this dichotomy, Protestantism and Catholicism, Protestantism is embodiment of diversity, difference, kind of disunity. I'm applying this term disunity neutrally. It does not mean good or bad. It's a description of heterogeneous nature of Protestantism. While Catholicism is more homogeneous, it constitutes civilization, recognizable civilization. When we are talking about Catholic Church, it stands out as a recognizable phenomenon, as a recognizable entity. No matter if we are talking about 11th century or 21st century, we've got the Pope, and the Holy See is in Rome, and the Pope is still the head of Catholic Church, as it used to be 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, right? And of course, Catholic doctrine has also been evolving, changing, but still essentially it's the same doctrine in terms of its major message, in terms of what message it's trying to get across. Okay, do you agree with that? Protestantism, an embodiment of diversity, and Catholic moments of history as embodiment of unity, embodiment of kind of holistic system. So apart from Catholic Church itself, we can name some other examples of these Catholic moments of history, like Ottoman Empire, right? It was a kind of Ottoman Empire, Osmanska Empire, a kind of recognizable and identifiable entity, both in time and space, in cultural, political, economic, societal, and military terms, or British or Western liberalism, or liberal capitalism, and institutions associated with this mode of civilization, with this type of society. with this institutional matrix. And according to Javid, Leninism constitutes, despite the fact it was quite short-lived. The lifespan of Leninism was less than 100 years ago. In fact, it was significantly less than 100 years ago, around 70 years. And nothing in historical terms, right? Nothing. Like Romanov dynasty in Russian Empire had ruled for over 300 years. Min dynasty in China ruled for almost 300 years. Sorry, not Min. Manchu Qin dynasty ruled China since mid 17th century till beginning of the 20th century. So almost like over 250 years. And then we are talking about 70 years. But these 70 years were very formative because new type of society was born, and it was an attempt to fashion modern institutions of modernity. Just don't forget the title, the name of our course, Modernity and its conflicts within the context of modernity and its conflicts, to make long story short. And we are looking at different types of conflicts, like social, political conflicts, and military conflicts as well. The second part of this course will be dealing with military conflicts, and the first part, which I'm teaching, is dealing with social, political, ideological conflicts. So it was an attempt to fashion institutions of alternative modernity. Alternative to what? Alternative to liberal capitalism. But then Emmanuel Wallistein comes into play with the help of his faithful disciple, Georgii Derluguian. Georgii Derluguian, in one of his articles, recollects a conversation with Wallistein, and that conversation, well, sounds unbelievable, but that's true. That conversation took place in Mozambique in mid-80s, during civil war in Mozambique, and Mozambique was supported. Mozambique's leadership proclaimed that they had chosen the path towards socialism, and they were supported by the Soviet Union. So Derluguian, as a student of Institute of Asian and African countries, was dispatched to Mozambique to work as an advisor and interpreter to local authorities, and to act as a liaison between Soviet representatives to Mozambique and Mozambican leadership. Derluguian recounts Wallistein as saying, "What makes you so sure that in 2017," and the conversation took place in 1987, so the 70th anniversary of October Revolution. And Wallistein remarked, "What makes you so sure that on 2017, there will be a parade in Moscow to celebrate 100th centenary of October Revolution in Moscow? What makes you think that this very country, called now Soviet Union, will still exist?" Again, in 1987, it did not sound credible. Very few scholars would dare to think that the Soviet Union, Eastern European satellites of Soviet Union would collapse, would go extinct in 2 years, 1987, and Eastern European Leninism went extinct in 1989. And then Soviet Union would follow the suit in 1999, would disappear, would be dissolved, and the whole system, Leninist system, would be dismantled. So this is one of few kind of successful predictions in social sciences, and unfortunately underestimated predictions. So Leninism. The defining features of Leninism, but before focusing on defining features of Leninism as a type of regime, let us think why this regime was introduced, well, invented and imposed in former Russian Empire. Lenin himself, living in exile, was very pessimistic about prospects of revolution in Russia. He wrote that, well, our generation, my generation, Lenin's generation, we are not going to see revolution happening in Russian Empire. Regime is too strong. Perhaps next generations will be able to bring down the regime, imperial regime, and bring about the radical social change, which Marxists call revolution, define as revolution. But then something happened. Well, apart from Russian Empire, also two more empires collapsed, were dissolved, Ottoman Empire and Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and German Empire also had its own revolution, and it became a republic, so-called Weimar Republic. So Russian Empire, German Empire, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire. Four empires ceased to exist. Only British Empire managed to survive World War I. So out of 5 empires which entered the war, 4 ceased to exist, and 2 out of these 4 simply disintegrated, totally disintegrated. Like compare Austrian-Hungarian Empire, look at its map, look at Austrian-Hungarian Empire on the map of Europe before the war, and look at these states which emerged after the collapse empire, after the World War I, like it's Austria itself, German-speaking Austria, Czechoslovakia, some parts were incorporated into future Yugoslavia, Poland, so quite a few, and Hungary, last but not least Hungary. One of the outcomes of the World War I and its disruption, because now it's popular to talk about disruption, being smart and savvy in the age of disruption, but our age of disruption is nothing in comparison with age of disruption generated by World War I and subsequent events, like these civil wars, conflicts, and then emergence of these repressive totalitarian systems like Leninist system and fascist systems. So again, we live, we still live in interesting times, but they are not as disruptive as events of the beginning of the 20th century were. So two more remarks. Friedrich Engels, he wrote in one of his articles or letters in late 19th century, so about 20 years, at least 20 years before the World War I, that there would be a huge war in Europe, and that war would become a global conflict. And as the result of that war, traditional monarchies, traditional empires would be destroyed, and nobody would even bother to pick up these royal crowns from the ground because of this amount of destruction brought about by that future global conflict, global war. And Georgii Derluguian, he wrote an article where he came up with the notion or with the idea that World War I was a collective suicide for Europe. And quite a few historians, well, they're puzzled why World War I happened. Of course, the world was conflict-ridden, but these were more, well, relatively, well, not local, but regional conflicts. And Germany was growing, and the German Empire was growing, and so were ambitions of German Empire. It grew very ambitious, and the German leadership thought that, well, the world was unjust, that they were too late to colonize the world outside of the Europe, outside of the European proper. And this, although Germany did have a colonial empire, and it was quite big, like contemporary Tanzania, a huge African country, at least twice the size of Germany, or 3 times the size of Germany. Namibia, if they waited for some time, they would discover diamonds there in Namibia. And on the top of that, Germans were extremely bad colonial administrators. They didn't know what to do with their colonies. They were not profitable. They were losing money because, unlike British and French, they didn't have any experience in these colonial undertakings. So their rule was extremely ruthless, brutal. In Namibia, for example, they basically organized a genocide against local population. There was a rebellion against German rule, and the Germans replied with genocide. And they were unhappy that they didn't have enough colonies, but they were a burden for them. So instead of focusing on economic growth, instead of focusing on conquering markets, they decided to start the war, which became a World War I and lasted for 4 years. And I'm talking a lot about events of World War I and surrounding events, because it was something that triggered all these revolutions, and revolution in Russian Empire. Again, let me quote Georgii Derluguian. He defines that revolution, which happened in October, which happened in Russian Empire. He defines it as a Soviet revolution, and he thinks that the lifespan of this revolution was years of 1917, 1945. So after World War II, Soviet Union emerged as a military industrial superpower. And then we can legitimately claim that kind of period of revolutionary transformation ended. And then regime, kind of Soviet regime, Leninist regime, began to stabilize, more or less, of course, more or less. So it's a very interesting approach because historical sociology in general, and Georgii Derluguian in particular, they help us realize that revolutions, well, Derluguian was not the first one to realize that. Prior to him, there had been a French historian, Furet, who wrote a book about French Revolution. And according to Furet, French Revolution lasted around 100 years, beginning with events 1789 and ending closer to the end of 19th century when Republican regime in France finally became stable and kind of uncontested political regime. But in case of revolution in Russian Empire, it was not a one-time event. It was a process, and I think it's legitimate to conceptualize it as a process lasting from 1917 till 1945. So Lenin, writing in 1910s, around that time, came up with an idea of the weakest link in the chain of imperialist state. And predictably, well, for us, predictably, in hindsight, he defined Russian Empire as the weakest link in this chain of imperial states. And he was thinking that, well, perhaps that weakest link could be broken, could be torn apart. Or in other words, that revolution could be started in such a state. And Russian Empire was embodiment of different contradictions and conflicts. Well, the biggest land empire on the one hand, military powerful, yet as I mentioned before, this mighty military power had suffered a humiliating defeat from much smaller Japanese empire. On the one hand, Russian Empire was rapidly developing in economic terms, industrializing. And don't forget that Ukraine was one of the key elements of that industrial economic growth of late Russian Empire. So working class proletariat was developing, was forming. It was not numerous. It was mostly peasant society, and according to some historians, the literacy rate in Russian Empire was the same as in Kievan Rus under Yaroslav the Wise. So 900 years passed, and the literacy rate remained the same, which is incredible. Early medieval state of Kievan Rus and early 20th century European empire, kind of heavily integrated into European affairs. So huge inequality, exploitation, very obsolete, antiquated system of land relations, when the nobility owned, possessed most of the land, while impoverished peasantry, which made majority of the population in Russian Empire, possessed very little or close to nothing. And of course, antiquated political structure, very rigid imperial structure. Well, after revolution of 1905, 1907, some elements of parliamentarism were introduced, constitutionalism, but they were extremely limited, and they were at whims of the sovereign, at whims of the emperor. So not surprisingly that the course of event of World War I on a battlefield was not very good for Russian Empire and its armed forces. When Russian Empire, Russian Imperial Army faced German army, it would normally be defeated. It had an upper hand against its kind of counterpart of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, equally old or even older dynasty. Habsburg ruled that realm since 15th century. So, almost half a millennium length rule for Habsburg in case of Habsburg, and a very heterogeneous empire, ethnically, culturally, religiously. And by the way, having said that, that Austrian-Hungarian Empire was heterogeneous, the same is true of Russian Empire. It was heterogeneous, ethnically, culturally, religiously on the one hand, and it was extremely unequal on the other hand, like unequal treatment of Jewish population, sizable Jewish population. There was this Pale of Settlement, so-called Pale of Settlement, beyond which Jewish population could not reside, with some minor exceptions, like only wealthy merchants could live beyond that Pale of Settlement. So a lot of discrimination based on religion, mostly religion and ethnicity, and a lot of contradictions, social, political, ideological, and last but not least, economical. And again, here comes into play, into our scheme of things, well, systems analysis, and I'm trying to combine in my historical sociology of Leninist regimes. I am trying to combine Javid's approach with well systems insights. So Wallistein was correct in noting that Russian Empire was a semi-periphery, squeezed between periphery and the states of the core. And some of Emmanuel Wallistein's colleagues came up with the notion of, and I think pretty useful notion, contradictions of semi-peripheral development. Contradictions of semi-peripheral development. I think it's, again, very useful, very insightful, because again, semi-periphery is full of conflicts. Why? Because it combines mutually exclusive elements, those of periphery, and of pure periphery, and those of core states. And semi-peripheries, more often than not, and especially in case of semi-peripheral states with a sizable military, which managed to show its military prowess, they strive for membership in the core. They strive to join the states of the core of world system, which make their behavior on the global scale pretty aggressive, and they cannot compete economically. But in case of Russian Empire, due to size, territorial size, and demography, it could try to compete militarily. So that was one of the reasons why. So Russian Empire was heavily dependent on capital, on Western capital, mostly French capital. That's the reason why and we also have to keep that in mind and kind of unleash our sociological imagination and think sociologically, not historically and not psychologically, but sociologically. Because rulers of Russian Empire, they were essentially of German origin, right? They were ethnic Russian emperors. They were ethnic Germans. And again, 20th century, it's the beginning of the age of mass society, mass politics, and mass society, mass politics these practices, these ideas are rooted into idea of nation state. So if you are legitimate, then you don't belong to this nation. So to belong to this nation in ethnic terms, although we should keep in mind that nation should not and cannot be reduced to ethnicity. But it does have some elements of ethnicity. There is a relationship, a correlation between nation and ethnic basis. Although nation is a political construction, political construct. So if you want to belong to these nations, then you have to cope with being illegitimate in a sense of your lineage, in a sense of your origins. So to sum it up, lots of contradictions. We don't know how things would have developed had not World War I broke out. My guess is that Russian Empire had not World War I started, could have well survived, and it would have looked like something like Japan, which is technically still an empire. And in Japan, you come across lots of things which look familiar to people who are relatively well read in like late 19th, early 20th century Russian literature, like school uniforms. Boys' school uniforms in Japan are the same as school uniforms in Russian Empire. Can you imagine that? They borrowed it from Germany in second part of 19th century, and it has not been changed. So it's again the same. Lenin was wearing that type of school uniform. But anyway, let's not focus on speculations. Let's focus on what actually happened. For revolution to start and to be successful, we need conflict within ruling elite, and we also need a counter elite. And Lenin, he managed his genius, and evil genius, but still, was in the fact that he devised this novel institution. Ken Javid himself says that both Leninism and fascism, there were two attempts to provide an alternative to liberal capitalist bourgeois social, political, and moral order. It was an attempt, ecstatic attempt, irrational attempt, using modern technologies, using advances in modern science to overcome the social and political, cultural, ideological, and moral institutions of the liberal, capitalist, individualistic, bourgeois world, and replace it with something else, with a holistic community. Remember German sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies and his distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. These are the only two German words I know, apart from Herrschaft, which is domination, extensively used by Weber. Having mentioned Weber, have to tell you that we forgot to add him to our list of thinkers who are extremely helpful in for our understanding of Leninism as a political regime. In fact, Weber is a key to understanding Leninism, and Javid's writing are heavily influenced by Weber, his ideas, and are drawing heavily upon Weber. So Weber, Max Weber, and his types of domination. Both fascism and Leninism are inherently contradictory in the sense that they employ modern technologies, modern science, in an attempt to bring about irrational revolution, to replace these rational institutions of bourgeois and individualism, bourgeois Protestant methodical acquisition. These are all Max Weber's notions, with something else, with something irrational, with a thrust to future, to new institutions. But Marxism or Leninist regimes are different, that they were based on quite powerful sets of theories developed by Marx, Engels, and their followers. But anyway, without Lenin, Marxism would have probably remained as an influential theory and no more than exotic ideology. Lenin kind of brought it to political life because he came up with an idea of combining two mutually exclusive, conflicting entities. He came up with, well, he did not use these exact terms, but he provided the description that fits neatly, kind of dovetails with the explanation provided by Ken Javid. And Ken Javid defines defining feature, so to speak, for Ken Javid, the defining feature of Leninism is the notion of impersonal charisma. It's very interesting. I think it's a breakthrough achievement in terms of thinking about social and political institutions and processes and ideological formations. Because for Max Weber, charisma is an attribute of an individual, right? As such, charisma, charismatic type of leadership, charismatic domination, it opposes both legal rational domination, which is totally depersonalized, of course, in ideal typical terms, and traditional domination, because by definition, traditional domination clings to the past, to tradition. Yet, while charisma is a revolutionary force, charisma is a force of change, and the bearer of charisma is an individual. Weber often cites example of Jesus Christ as a kind of charismatic figure, because Christ, if you conduct a very simple content analysis of Christ preaching and teaching, he often says that it is said that so and so, but I say that it should be different. Remember his famous it's not meant for Saturday, it's a Saturday for men, right? So, and Saturday is a holiday in Judaism. So he revises. Well, he's not just revising, he's giving a total overhaul to religious teaching, while claiming that he is a part of that teaching. He is a son of God, son of Jewish God, to simplify things. So charisma, traditionally, and according to Weber, had always been seen as a revolutionary force, but a revolutionary force owned by an individual. So when we are talking about charismatic leadership, charismatic rule, we are talking about individual who opposes either structures, this iron cage of legal, rational, bureaucratic, capitalist, impersonal modernity, institutions of that legal, rational, depersonalized modernity, or opposes that stubborn tradition of old Gemeinschaft. And Lenin came up with the revolutionary idea of so-called professional revolutionaries. So on the one hand, if you are a professional revolutionary, you are a charismatic, you are individual, heroic individual, but you are defined as such as long as and only as long as you are a member of a bigger group, a member of a party. Ken Javid offers a very insightful comparison. Any party is a bureaucracy. Nevertheless, Leninist parties, they managed to command undivided loyalty and enthusiasm towards them. So remember French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, famous thinker, who wrote extremely famous volume Democracy in America, and also produced a wonderful account of French Revolution, ancient regime and revolution in France. So writing in 19th century, he said that despotic regimes, tyrannies, they don't care what people think about them, as long as subjects are obedient. So you may think in a kind of traditional type of tyranny, you may think whatever you want about your rulers, as long as you behave, as long as you stay within regime-imposed boundaries, as long as you are obedient. Leninist regimes are not like that. They are totally different. They're like that society described in Orwell's 1984. They demand undivided loyalty. They demand affection from its subjects. They demand sacrifice from its subjects. So they're bureaucracies, yet they succeeded in transforming themselves into charismatic bureaucracies. Just think about this, because again, it's contradiction in terms, because bureaucracy is dull. Bureaucracy is about procedure. Bureaucracy is about following the law. Again, it's kind of not for nothing Weber defined this type of domination as legal, rational, and legality and rationality. Kind of nothing personal, as they say, nothing unpredictable, nothing ecstatic. And ecstatic is the Greek for impulsive, unpredictable, revolutionary. Ken Javid says, can you imagine someone dying for DMV? DMV stands for Department of Motors and Vehicles. It's American equivalent of our Servisny Center MVS, or prior to that we had this state road inspectors, state road inspectorate, DAI. So imagine, impersonal charisma, owned, belonging to the party as a collective entity. And that gave a very strong, unusual, but very strong incentive to newly recruited members. Having joined the party, you almost immediately become a member of exclusive community, a community of virtuosio, virtuous community. Max Weber often used the term borrowed from music, virtuoso, music, religious virtuoso. And by the way, this term is linked to term virtue. Virtue is worth, value. So being virtuoso, like we say that he put up a virtuoso violin performance, that it was fantastic, brilliant. Having joined this community, Leninist community, you become a member of exclusive group of people who claim very important thing. They claim that they possess the knowledge of inexorable laws of history, inexorable, unavoidable laws of history, kind of natural laws of history, because they are Marxist. So their ideological underpinning was not that these rulers are bad, so let's replace them with good rulers, or these people are bad, let's replace them with good people. Their message was that the system is wrong because it's unjust, it's unequal. You've got the dominance of ruling classes, and the state is just but an executive committee of the ruling class, and in capitalist society it's bourgeoisie, and in case of Russian Empire you got this strange mixture, hybrid regime, as it's popular to say nowadays, hybrid regime combining bourgeoisie with a representative of traditional landed aristocracy, with an emperor at the top, also again antiquated system, an absolute monarch at the beginning of the 20th century, and majority of landless population. So again, mixture of different contradictions, mixture of different conflicts. And you've got this group of people who consider themselves exclusive because they possess exclusive knowledge of the laws of history. They know how to change history. And that's something that motivates them to sacrifice themselves for the common cause, for the revolutionary cause. And that was the reason. That was the reason why Leninist party managed to come to power, but not just managed to come to power, it managed to win bloody, extremely bloody civil war. The human losses of civil war greatly surpassed those of World War I for Russian Empire. So Russian Empire lost around 4 million people during World War I, and the human toll of civil war was at least 8 million people. So horrible losses, but they managed to win the civil war, and they managed to stay in power for 70 years. redefining all social, political, cultural, and ideological institutions in a radical fashion and producing new type of society, some sort of alternative again to liberal capitalist modernity. And again, speaking in well systemic terms, Leninism was an attempt to break through that dependency on nations of the core and to introduce so-called catch-up development, catch up with leading nations and even others. But there was more than that. Leninists claimed that since they knew the laws of history, they would be able to manage not just to catch up with leading nations, but to overtake them. They claimed that their project wasn't just another project of modernity. It was entirely new project, bringing about system never seen before. But in reality, the system that Bolsheviks, so-called Bolsheviks, followers of Lenin, introduced was modeled on practices of a military industrial complex of German Empire during World War I, because it was a society of high degree of mobilization, not just military mobilization, but economic mobilization, ideological mobilization, and concentration of production forces in private hands. And Lenin himself wrote that German Empire shows us German Empire is one step behind socialism, because they achieved incredible concentration of means of production, and the state plays a critical role in managing economic affairs. So we just have to match that concentration of economic means, which is, according to some thinkers, it's a defining feature of socialism. So we have to match them with a political shell, with a new political shell, because economic background had already been created by this state monopolistic capitalism. But again, Leninism, American social scientist, mid-20th century, Philip Selznick, defined Leninism and Leninist type of party as an organizational weapon. Very neat description and definition. So weapon organization which can be used as a weapon of destruction of its enemies and as a tool to bring about radical societal changes. I think that's extremely well taken point and very relevant notion. So Leninism was a political and ideological and organizational phenomenon which emerged in a semi-peripheral country, and it was motivated by the desire to get rid of this dependency on core nations. It was motivated by desire to radically modernize the nation in question, and its defining feature in political and ideological terms was impersonal charisma. And then Next week, we'll talk about stages of evolution, stages of development of developmental stages of Leninist regime, and contradictions of every stage, and how these contradictions, how these conflicts tore the whole system apart and caused its undoing, brought it down.